The Hungaroring and great racing are two things that usually don't go well together. It's called Monaco without the walls for a reason. But while this year's Hungarian Grand Prix didn't really give us anything for the first 55 laps or so, for the remaining 15 laps, we did get some edge-of-your-seat stuff. Anybody who said it was dull expecting it to be a no-holds-barred adrenaline-fueled edge-of-your-seat thrill ride from start to finish was deluded. Martin Brundle said it on commentary. It's been this way for decades. Plural. Getting past at the Hungaroring is incredibly difficult, even back in the days of cars having full seconds between each other like they did back in the 90s and early 2000s. But that's not to say there haven't been exciting Hungarian Grand Prix in my lifetime. 1997 with Damon Hill almost winning in an Arrows because his Bridgestones held up while the Goodyears were getting cooked. There's also Jenson Button in 2006, the 2014 race, the 2021 race to an extent. Those are just 3 or 4 that spring to mind. And you know what affected 3 of those 4 races? Rain. There had been some rainfall early Sunday morning affecting the F2 and F3 races, but it had all cleared up by the time the Grand Prix started. The official chance of rain that the FIA has, and yes, that's a real thing they have, was something like 10 or 20% or so. So 3 wet races back to back never happened. Has it actually happened? Answers on a postcard. But the Hungaroring is a track that weirdly I've turned a lot of laps on in the old Jeff Cramman Grand Prix games. I don't know why, maybe it's the challenging nature or the fact it's so difficult to overtake. I could make my own little trolley train. I wouldn't necessarily win the race, but a gap of over 30 seconds to the guy in front was worth it for like 2 points under the old top 6 system. I do need to try that x86 version of Grand Prix 2 at some point, but anyway, it's a circuit that has the twists of Monaco, the scenery of the Nürburgring, the ups and downs of Bathurst, and the something of something. Insert your own description here. It's a neat track, but races are often won in the pit lane there. Which is what happened yesterday. Teams started looking towards strategy to get their cars in front, but it all turned on its head when one of the cars that was in contention for the win dropped off completely. And there were several shocks from the weekend. The first shock was the pace of the Aston Martins, and they enjoyed a mega turnaround from their fortunes at Spa, where they had their worst race on record. They then had their best qualifying session of the year at the Hungaroring. It was just a complete 180. It's more likely that this is the one track that suits the car best than Adrian Newey working his magic. But it's always good to see somebody else get right up there instead of the usual suspects. Alonso and Stroll were an impressive 5th and 6th on the grid, with Stroll only 100th off his teammate. But the second shock was how far the Red Bull was compared to usual, and yes, Red Bull, singular. Now when I say that, we're usually talking about Verstappen being a couple of tenths off the McLarens, but still, 2nd, 3rd or 4th on the grid, depending on how Russell or Leclerc do. But this time, Verstappen had his worst qualifying performance of the season down in 8th, which is 1 place lower compared to where he was in Bahrain. And I've said before about how much the Red Bull lacks balance and lacks rotation, and at the same time absolutely hates rear limited tracks, which the Hungaroring certainly is. But we've seen at other circuits where Red Bull have done badly initially, they fixed it in between Friday and Saturday. They make a couple of tweaks, the balance somehow improves, and Max can work around what's left. It's the Bono my tyres of 2025. They look like they'll do badly, but then Max is on the front row and it's all, wow, that's brilliant. But in Friday afternoon practice, Max was down in 12th, or 14th. Either way, it wasn't looking pretty. Now before people get easily rattled and think that I'm ragging on Max, I'm not. I'm not ragging on him at all. If anything, this just shows how much the Red Bull fall-off has been in the last 18 months, and this race is the worst it's ever been. Now last year Max was in a similar position, where he was saying that he was shoving the brake balance back and still not getting any turning for the corners, and his frustrations piled up so much he later had that collision with Hamilton, with Lambiase on the pit wall saying, "I'm not getting into a radio war with the other teams, this is childish," and stuff to that effect. Hungary was probably Max's worst race last year, and it's been the worst race so far for him this year as well. Although it has to be said that this year's Hungarian Grand Prix was much worse than the previous year's Hungarian Grand Prix because Max was anonymous all weekend. Still to come, we've got the Singapore Grand Prix, and it's probably not going to be much better there either. The Red Bull did have the turn in and it had a little bit more balance than it did last year, but the problem this year was that it just had no grip whatsoever. But there were some positives. Tsunoda was only 1/10.5 off Max in the first qualifying session and was just shy of the cutoff to get into the second qualifying session, while Max still made the top 10 shootout. Conspiracies are currently flying around on internet that Yuki has finally got the same car and it's Max pulled back to Yuki rather than the other way around. The internet is a funny place. Yuki praised the balance of the car, saying that it was at a better place now, it's just that grip was something that the Red Bull did not have. But while Red Bull had issues, Aston had surprised themselves, not just the people watching. They were nowhere at Spa, but for this race they'd reverted to the floor used at Imola, where the two cars also did pretty well, and high downforce seems to be going alright for them. There's no long straights at the Hungaroring to get in the way of a draggy car, and the Aston can run without getting absolutely creamed in a straight line because there's nowhere for that drag to be overcome by cars that are more aerodynamically efficient. But the number one story to come out of qualifying was that Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari had somehow nabbed pole position, ahead of the two McLarens of Piastri and Norris, who had been dominant all weekend. His pole position was part of the closest top 10 shootout in history, with the entire top 10 separated by about half a second. The two McLarens just didn't hook it up and Charles got himself a pole position that, at a track where it's so difficult to get past, might serve him well. This was also amplified by Leclerc's teammate Hamilton being well off the pace. While one driver was on a high, the other was considering going home. Ferrari nailed the one-lap setup for that car, but that might come back to bite them as running the car that way would just burn up the rears in the race. Leclerc had absolutely gone for it in the final lap of qualifying, while the two McLarens were a bit more cautious, particularly in the final corner. Charles didn't have much to lose, the McLarens did, but either way we got something to talk about at the end of qualifying. So the top 10 was made up of Leclerc, Piastri, Norris, Russell, Alonso, Stroll, Bortoleto, who also had a fantastic qualifying, Verstappen, Lawson and Hadjar. So in the race, if the McLarens wanted to win, they either had to overtake Leclerc on track, particularly into turn 1, or get past him with the strategy. Oscar couldn't get past Leclerc into turn 1 defending from Lando, so he had to get past him on track, but then McLaren started to cook up a strategy to try and get Oscar in front of Charles and maybe win the race. Although that might have been his undoing. While Oscar kept second place into turn 1, Lando was dumped down behind Russell and Alonso. It was a case of, oh god, here we go again, because we've usually seen this from Lando over the last season and a half, bottling his starts. And I'm sure a lot of people were getting their phones out and heading to social media or Discord and saying, he's done it again, Oscar's going to pull more of a gap in the championship now. And admittedly, I was one of those people on Discord, because my opinion was, it's too difficult to overtake at the Hungaroring, Lando will lose too much time in the opening stint being stuck behind other cars, and that's going to mess his strategy up. And while it was expected that Piastri would be able to overtake Leclerc within a few laps, given that the McLaren had superior race pace and had also been dominant all weekend, and also had better tyre management, Leclerc managed to defy everybody and keep the Ferrari in the lead. On lap 8, Leclerc was 3 seconds up the road from the McLaren, with Norris behind Russell and chasing him for third. On that same lap, or maybe even the lap before due to the radio broadcast delays, Oscar was asked about a one stop where he said, "The tyres feel okay for now, but it's difficult to know with so many laps to go." At that point, the track temperature had cooled a tiny bit, so there was the possibility that a one stop could be done. This being compared to the thermonuclear track temperatures that they had on Friday. Lando had been told by his engineer they were thinking of doing plan A -5, so if they had a target lap that they wanted to come in, they were going to shorten that stint by 5 laps and bring Lando in a little bit earlier, and Lando thought that was a good idea because his tyres were getting destroyed. On the same lap that that radio chatter was broadcast, Oscar came into the pits. Piastri was trying the undercut, where you pit first and use the new tyres to close the gap on the guy ahead who has older tyres, so that the time lost in the pit stop is overcome by the time the car in front pits, if you follow. This strategy works better at tracks where tyre wear is very high, like Hungary, otherwise you might try the overcut, which is the opposite. Pit later and you still have an advantage. The thing with the undercut is you need a stonking outlap in clean air to get the tyres up to temperature as quickly as possible. Leclerc and Russell came in the next lap, and that released Lando into clean air. So with clean air, Lando no longer needed to nurse his tyres, and he took those mediums further and further and further. Oscar meanwhile wasn't able to leapfrog Leclerc as McLaren planned. The gap reduced by a second, but that was it, and McLaren wasn't helped by Ferrari also having a stellar pit stop. Leclerc's stop was about 2 seconds, Oscar 1.9. Fast stops all round at the front. On lap 25, with Lando still having not pitted, Oscar's radio chatter was broadcast again. "Will the one stop work?" he asked. "Difficult," said his engineer. It wasn't until lap 32 that Lando finally pitted, taking on the hard tyres. While Leclerc and Piastri had to commit to a 2-stop because the tyre life just was not going to be there, Lando, if he wanted, could do a 1-stop, this being how different the whole thing had worked out over the course of the Grand Prix. The expected range of the hard tyre was around 40 to 45 laps, so Lando was in the window but would require a bit of tyre saving. Ascher and Leclerc were not going to make the end on the tyres that they were on. It was beginning to look like the opposite of Spa, where Lando was pitted twice and Ascher just once. One strategy looked to be the optimal, but another strategy would work at the same time. At Spa, most of the drivers pitted expecting a 2-stop race, and when Hülkenberg pitted for his second set of dry tyres, it should have made everybody else react. But the vast majority of the cars stayed out, and it was only those towards the rear of the field that pitted twice come the end. On lap 41, McLaren dummied to bait Leclerc into pitting. With the tyres able to go a bit longer, they left Piastri out so that he'd have fresher tyres for that final stint and used that to the advantage instead. The radio communication with Ascher was box to overtake Leclerc, which basically means do the opposite of what he's doing. So if Leclerc pits, stay out, and if Leclerc stays out, you come in. At the end of lap 45 is when Ascher came in for his second stop. Push and box was the instruction, and Ascher said that the best chance of beating Lando was the goal, not beating Leclerc. So the question is, did McLaren do what Ferrari did in the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix of 2010, where they were too busy worrying about what Webber was doing that Vettel snatched the title from under their noses? That's your postcard moment for today. Piastri utterly destroyed the gap to Leclerc when he came out of the pits after his second stop, overcoming a 7-second gap to go around the outside of turn 1 and then pull away to the tune of about a second a lap, which is absolutely mental considering he only had, 5 or 6 lap fresher tyres. So not only was Leclerc losing the win and a second place, he was now in third, he was also suffering from really bad handling issues, which we'll get to in a bit. But not only was the win getting away from him, Russell was catching up as well. So at this point, there was no real reason for Norris to pit. He could stay out, and so long as he managed that left front, he should have been fine. Ascher had to deal with getting past Leclerc, and had he completed the overcut and got in front in the pit stops, maybe it would have been different. But it is what it is. If Norris pitted, he'd have been behind both cars, so they took the punt. A 2-stopper was the fastest strategy to go with at the start of the day, but as the Grand Prix went on, the 1-stop had, somehow, become a viable strategy too. Although, let's not take anything away from both drivers here. Lando saved his tyres and Ascher was driving like a man possessed to close the gap. It had elements of Hamilton in 2019 when Mercedes did the same thing at Hungary to win from Verstappen, or when Schumacher pumped in those qualifying laps to win in 1998. I'm not saying they're the same, just that they remind you of it. Russell meanwhile had closed up on Leclerc and tried to make an overtake, and Leclerc in his frustration did resort to some iffy moves while defending when Russell was able to get by on lap 62. Not something that you'd expect from Charles, but it is what it is, and the over-aggressive defending, or moving in the braking zone, whatever you want to call it, resulted in Leclerc getting a 5-second time penalty at the end of the race. So not really a penalty because it didn't affect his race position. Ascher was chopping at the gap, taking chunks and chunks and chunks and chunks out of Lando over the remaining laps. With about 2 laps to go, he tried to make an overtake but couldn't make it stick, locking up his wheels and almost crashing into his teammate, a bit like what nearly happened in Austria. But Lando managed to hold on, with no mistakes this time, and managed to secure the win from Ascher by just over half a second. But McLaren had surprised themselves with this whole 1-stop business. Andrea Stella said after the race, that Piastri's tyres were already fading in that opening stint and was losing a bit of time to Leclerc, so the undercut was worth a punt to try and get by. But I reckon they did it a tad too early. If they'd done it a few laps later, would the tyre offset have been more as to allow Ascher to be closer? Probably, probably not. F1 is if backwards, etc. But McLaren, like many, thought that the 2-stopper was going to be the best strategy, but the longer things went on with Lando, the more they went, hang on a minute, this might actually work. McLaren also checked with Ascher what he wanted to do, and if he wanted the chance at winning, he had to dispatch with Leclerc, and he needed a tyre delta to help with that. As it turns out, the two strategies ended up converging so that they were both the right strategy to be on, with hindsight, and it did give us some edge-of-seat stuff right at the end. But the question remains, what the hell happened to Leclerc? And he was absolutely livid come the end. He initially blamed Ferrari adding some front wing to his car at the second stop for things going backwards, but it's been mentioned that it was a chassis issue. Leclerc said that every corner the car was behaving differently in that final stint, and it also means that Leclerc's pole to win conversion rate continues to diminish. There's also a theory that Ferrari cranked up the tyre pressures for that final stint because of the way the Ferrari reacts as fuel burns off, and they did it to make sure they didn't get caught out by excessive plank wear like Hamilton had done in China. But something does point to chassis rather than anything else, even if the exact cause hasn't been confirmed yet. Alex Brundle posted his theories on his Instagram page based off what Russell had said in the media pen after the race. The Ferrari is at its lowest ride height when the tyres are worn and also at a lower pressure because the downforce is pushing the car into the road. So they'd been lifting and coasting at certain areas of the track to fix that because downforce will be at its highest going into turn 1. In doing so, they can run lower around the rest of the circuit without ruining the plank. It's also thought that Ferrari turned the pressures up on the tyres to help increase the ride height, but since the tyre can't move around as much with higher tyre pressures, it reduces the contact patch. But it does lift the car up, reducing the risk of excessive plank wear. Does it mean that Ferrari is cheating? Not at all. They're just trying to run to the limits as all the other teams are, but they just have to be more careful because of the way their car works. Ferrari does have a chassis issue in the opinion of Alex, that being that the chassis is too close to the ground. Either way, in that final stint, Leclerc finished 42 seconds behind Norris, despite having way fresher tyres. So in a way, Norris having that bad start ended up helping him in the end. Russell diving out of his way when he had his pit stop helped Norris too, so there is some luck involved, and it gave him clean air to help extend the stint. But it won't stop people claiming sabotage or helping Lando and favouritism and British bias and everything else. Lando held on in Hungary much like he did at Austria, so fair play to him. Lando got lucky with his situation, Oscar got unlucky with his. It is what it is, and as the race evolved, the potential for a new strategy presented itself. Remember at the previous Grand Prix, one McLaren did a one-stop, the other did a two-stop, and virtually the same situation played out in both races. The one-stopping car won, the two-stopping car came second. Although Oscar was closer to Lando than Lando was to Oscar. But the battle at the front shouldn't detract from the fact that the two Astons came home in good scoring positions, as did the Sauber of Bortoleto who took the fan vote driver of the day honours. But I don't think anybody expected Verstappen to finish so far down the order, coming home in 9th, just one position back from where he started. I don't think anybody had Max finishing behind Bortoleto, both the Astons and Lawson on a 2025 accumulator, and this being on pace alone rather than outside factors like damage, penalties or anything of the sort. The Hungaroring exposed the Red Bull's weaknesses and then some, and Verstappen has said that he doesn't think he'll win another race this year. But Leclerc will be thinking what could have been. He could have been on for a podium, and it'll be interesting to see what happened to his car in that final stint to fall off so badly. Aston meanwhile will be wondering how the car became so good at this one specific race and how they can replicate that in the second half of the season. The car was better than normal, but the fact it was so much better than normal will need looking at. But they've got about a month to look at things. Well, actually, no, they haven't, have they? Because it's a full-on shutdown. It's the summer break now, so we're about to get some summer slop from some of the other YouTube channels while I try to figure out what I'm going to do over here. But with 9 points between Oscar and Lando going into the summer break, the remainder of the season is still going to be mighty close. Like I said before, this is going to go down to Abu Dhabi, and whoever makes the least amount of mistakes will come out on top. So then, a look at the festivities surrounding the Hungarian Grand Prix and everything else that came with it. If this has been interesting for you and given you some food for thought, then do leave a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help with picture purchasing or anything else around here, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and everything else you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to top up the coffee cup, and memberships so you can do Patreon without Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.